reality better explained by the existence or non-existence of the God from the Bible. Arguing in the affirmative is the co-host of the Doulos Theology podcast and YouTube channel, currently pursuing a master's degree in theology, Chris. And arguing in the negative is the owner of the iDebate server and iFunny user, KingXerxes. Each debater will be given a 5-minute opening argument. After each debater has given their opening, they will have 10 minutes to rebut their opponent. After the rebuttals, they will have 20 minutes of open dialogue, asking each other questions with as minimal interruptions as possible. After the dialogue, they will both offer a 5-minute closing. This will conclude the debate, at which we will allow audience members to connect and ask questions to the debaters. The debaters will only answer questions they are directly asked, so if you wish to hear from both people, make sure to address them both. The Q&A will last 30 minutes. After this 30 minutes has expired, the recording will stop, and any further discussion between the debaters or the audience will not be included in the YouTube upload. The rules are quite simple. The debater will not be allowed to go over time during the opening, or they will be muted. The rebuttal, however, will be given 15 to 20 seconds of overlap, since the debaters will likely be creating it as they go along. The open dialogue will be as free as possible, and while the debaters are restricted from directly insulting each other at any point in the exchange, profanity will not be censored as long as it is not used gratuitously. If the conversation between the debaters becomes incoherent, I, the moderator, will intervene to bring the point back at hand. The closing will also last no more than 5 minutes, or the debater will be muted. During each phase of the debate, I will let the debaters know when they have 1 minute left, 30 seconds left, and 10 seconds left. And if they're still talking after their time expires, they will be muted and we will be moving on to the next phase. The audience is allowed to utilize the debate text chat to fact-check the debaters and deliberate the topic among themselves. However, you will not be allowed to connect until the Q&A, at which point a queue will be initiated for you to join if you wish to ask a question. If both debaters understand and agree to the rules, we will go ahead and begin. Chris, since you're arguing in the affirmative of the debate this evening, we will be giving your opening argument first. You may start whenever you're ready.
Thank you. All right, I want to thank all of you for gathering here this evening to discuss this important question. In this opening statement, I will be providing my worldview along with my basic argument, and then in my first rebuttal, I'll be providing my main justification for this argument. I want to thank you for being here, even if you're only here to watch a simple theist get owned by facts and logic. My hope is that this will be an enlightening conversation for everyone involved. We are meant to discuss whether the existence or non-existence of God better explains the reality in which we find ourselves. Now, it is important in any debate for the opposing parties to define their terms, and so I must state from the outset that, in my case for the existence of God, I am not committing myself to some general theism, whatever that may be. Instead, I am wholly committed to the God of the Bible, described in the Old and New Testaments of Scripture as he is understood by the Reformed Theological tradition of Christianity. My God is omnipotent, omniscient, self-sufficient, eternal, Trinitarian, sovereign, and transcendent, among other things. His Son, Jesus Christ, who is the second person of the Trinity, and who shares all of these attributes, descended to earth, being born as a man. Though he was innocent of all sin, he died a guilty man's death, bearing the sin of his people, and securing for them an eternal redemption. He rose from the dead, 3 days later, and now sits eternally enthroned at the right hand of God the Father. Jesus created this world and omnipotently directs and upholds this world by the decretive word of his power. He knows all things with certainty. All of the above has been revealed to us by God through his word in the Old and New Testaments of the Bible. The implications of this worldview, philosophical and otherwise, are legion, but I will mention just a few. I must first say a word about epistemology, that branch of philosophy that deals with knowledge, truth, and how we know it. The scriptures say that in Christ are hidden all the treasures of knowledge and wisdom in Colossians 2:3. What does this mean? If something is true, it is because God ordained it. If ever our knowledge corresponds to reality, we have learned something that God already knows. God created this world and he continually upholds it. He gave this world its logic by imposing his own orderly thoughts onto it, and the laws which govern its physical aspects are a result of his constant governance. When we think correctly, we are thinking God's thoughts. Because we depend on logic and natural laws to think, and because we depend on God's governance to maintain these natural laws in a fixed state, and thus ensure the repeatability of our reasoning, there can be no neutral ground when it comes to epistemology. The intellectual world in which every human thinks and operates is entirely God's domain. It is God's air that we breathe, even if we only take it in for the purpose of denying his existence. I am called upon in this debate to demonstrate that God's existence better explains our reality than his non-existence. My worldview does not answer this question in any uncertain or probabilistic terms. Rather, I offer you absolute epistemological certainty of the existence of the God of Scripture. You will find that, if this God did not exist as the Bible describes him, it would be completely impossible not only to explain our reality, but to investigate it and even establish its existence in any meaningful sense. You might say to me that this is a rather one-sided way to open a debate, but my God is a very one-sided God. Because all intellectual ground is his by right of creatorship, only by presupposing the Christian worldview are we able to account for the necessary preconditions of intelligibility. That is to say, only by making the God of Scripture our most fundamental epistemological starting point are we able to consistently apply and account for logic, reasoning, morality, and even knowledge itself. I will say again, only by making the God of Scripture our most fundamental epistemological starting point are we able to consistently apply and account for logic, reasoning, morality, and even knowledge itself. In saying this, I am making a transcendental argument for the existence of God. I am saying that because this world displays intelligibility, God must exist. Now, intelligibility is our ability to possess any measure of knowledge about reality. As such, it cannot be rationally denied, since a statement, intelligibility is false, is itself intelligible and makes a claim to knowledge. I am also saying that the God of the Bible is the only possible explanation for intelligibility. Now, because there is intelligibility and it can only be explained by the God of the Bible, then the God of the Bible must exist. Now, this argument is very easy to disprove, and that's the beauty of it. If my opponent can demonstrate that the Christian worldview reduces to absurdity or fails to meet the necessary preconditions of intelligibility, then I am fundamentally mistaken. But keep in mind that, for him to win this debate, he must also demonstrate that a worldview which does not include the Christian God is able to account for the necessary preconditions of intelligibility. During the rest of this debate, I would ask you, the audience, to gauge our presuppositions. I've told you what mine are, and I assure you that my opponent has presuppositions as well. I don't fault him for that. But one of us will be able to consistently utilize our presuppositions and demonstrate how they bear out in any rational task. This person will have won the debate. The other will be unaware of his presuppositions, constantly arguing contrary to what his own professed worldview allows.
10 seconds.
That person's worldview surely cannot account for this reality in any meaningful sense, and that person has lost the debate. Thank you.
Perfect. JT, you can start whenever you're ready.
Okay. Thanks, Chris, for that dialogue. Most of my argument is going to rely strictly on how the Bible defines what God is. Based on the wording of the question, I'm going to spend as few moments of my time on whether or not God exists, and more time on does God exist as the Bible describes him, because that's the God that we're talking about. If I grant for a moment that there is some sort of agent out there that is all-powerful and omniscient and created the universe, the next step would be to determine, is this the God of the Bible or the God of the Bhagavad Gita? Or perhaps one of the numerous unconceptualized and non-written gods that people worship throughout all of history. So how do I go about determining which of these gods is the one that actually exists and explains the existence of the universe? Well, the first way I would do that is to go and see what God supposedly did in the Bible. What is attributed to him? What are events that I could test to determine if they actually happened? And then perhaps they could only be explained by the all-powerful God of that particular scripture. The first event I would like to question is the Noachian flood fable. We know, according to all of geological science and every other physical science in support, that at no point in all of our history was the entire planet simultaneously submerged in water, especially not at any point when man walked the earth. The evidence for this is utterly overwhelming. We have trees that date back farther than when the flood supposedly occurred, according to the scriptures, where it's placed just before the rise of the Egyptian Empire, so some 10,000 years ago. What we can also determine is that if this flood did happen, it could only be engineered through supernatural means. What I mean by that is that there's no way that a flood like this could happen and it be adherent to the laws of physics as we know them. Several different postulations have come to try and describe how this flood might have happened in a natural means, but they all run into a physiological barrier that can't be overcome without the explanation of there's an all-powerful agent who did it by magic. Let's be real, that's what we're talking about here. We're explaining that the universe exists via magic, that it was willed into existence out of sheer nothing by a being that we can't fully comprehend and who somehow has the power to just manipulate reality on a whim. Which is a question I posed just last night to another person I was engaging with this discussion on. Did God create the universe out of pre-existing material or not? That will come into play later. More back to the flood. I think it's safe to say that most Christians don't accept that the flood happened in the way that the Bible says it did. The school of thought that adheres to the Noachian flood as a literal event in exactly the way the Bible describes is very, very fringe and almost exclusively American. They're called young earth creationists. And they spend quite an exorbitant amount of time describing how this flood would have happened according to natural means. But that starts to create a problem because now they're limiting their all-powerful God strictly to natural means. They have to somehow battle the physiological constraints of this event while simultaneously offering up an explanation that would allow it to fit within we know what is true about the world. That brings me to my next point. What do we know to be true about the world? If you told me that yesterday my sister had lunch at McDonald's, I probably wouldn't question you very much. But if yesterday you told me my sister had lunch on the surface of Mars, I would have more questions. For my sister to have lunch on the surface of Mars, it would require that certain things I know about the world, about the universe, to be fundamentally wrong, like no humans have made it to Mars yet, or it's impossible to make that journey with modern technology. We haven't got there yet. What I know to be true about the world, what I can effectively demonstrate to be true about the world, does not fit with the claim my sister had lunch on Mars yesterday. Likewise,
1 minute left.
What we know about the world doesn't fit with a worldwide flood happened. And if a worldwide flood did not happen, that means the Bible is incorrect about the history of the world. And if the Bible is incorrect about the history of the world, how can we trust it to be correct about the creator of the world? And if we can't trust it to be correct about the creator of the world, then how can we trust that that depiction of the creator of the world to be correct? How can we trust that it actually does explain our reality? I argue we can't, and therefore it doesn't explain anything. I'm done.
30 seconds. Okay, awesome. Thank you very much. Chris, are you ready to start your rebuttal?
Yes, I am.
Alrighty. Ready when you are.
All right, thank you, JT. Typically, in formal debates, the debaters will lay out their positions and opening arguments in their opening statements. Then the entirety of the rebuttals are used in order to refute and counter arguments used by their opponents. But as I mentioned before, time constraints forced me to leave out some of what I would normally include in an opening statement. You'll recall that before I made the sweeping claim that only by presupposing the Christian worldview are we able to consistently apply and account for logic, reasoning, morality, and even knowledge itself. This statement is bold and deserves justification. In order to do this, it is necessary that we examine some important problems in the area of epistemology. The first problem that I will be addressing is in regards to the laws of logic. This is especially important, and I'm opening with it, because both myself and my opponent will be explicitly appealing to these laws in tonight's debate. Or at least I assume so. But the question arises, how does one account for the laws of logic? And this is certainly pertinent to our debate. Not only are the laws of logic part of our reality, they are instrumental in the investigation of it. Now, I will not dispute that we can observe that the laws of logic have a repeatedly demonstrable success-generating feature about them. If we look closely enough, we can see how they are successfully utilized every day. But in a debate about the explanation for reality, we need to be able to explain this phenomenon if our argument is to be applicable in any way. To put it crassly, why do the laws of logic work? I propose that there is no good answer to this question within any non-Christian worldview. The most common answer that I get from my non-believing conversation partners is that the laws of logic work because they reflect the inherent properties of matter. But that only pushes things back a step. How do you explain uniform, constant, inherent properties of matter when any naturalistic explanation, by definition, limits itself to the matter and energy that it is trying to describe? Matter and energy, let me remind you, which is, under any modern scientific theory, under constant change, flux, and dynamic fluidity. To derive any sort of inherent constant from change and flux demands an explanation, and at this point we're beyond the range of the naturalist's epistemology. The second problem concerns the principle of induction. Inductive reasoning involves the use of specific evidences or observations to formulate general paradigms which accurately reflect the order of things and thus predict specific occurrences in the present and the future. The scientific method is completely reliant on inductive reasoning and thus the principle of induction in that it relies upon specific past observations and evidences in order to predict how this world will quote-unquote behave in the future. The principle of induction and thus all of the substantial amount of knowledge which a human race has accumulated through inductive reasoning in the scientific method presupposes that specific evidences can be expanded to general principles. Put another way, The inductive reasoner is reliant on the presupposition that the future will behave like the past. The problem is, there is no way at all to justify the claim that the future will behave like the past, or that the general can be derived from the specific. It is unprovable under a naturalist epistemology. Using past repeatable success of inductive reasoning does not solve the problem. That begs a question, using past observations to prove how the future will behave, assuming what it is trying to prove. This leaves the problem of induction as a serious epistemic problem which undermines all evidence-based and scientific knowledge acquired throughout human history. The third problem has to do with the extent of our knowledge. There is an unfathomably vast but still finite amount of knowledge to be had within our universe. If somebody knew all of the knowledge that there is to know about the universe, then of course he would have 100% of all the knowledge. Let's say that collectively humans have discovered 0.001% of the knowledge in the universe, and that's a very generous guess. What's outside of that 0.001% is anyone's guess. It could be that there is something true and absolutely fundamental that we do not know, which completely undermines and contradicts everything that we think we know. Something of this magnitude would mean that in actuality we know nothing at all. Whether or not this is the case is anybody's guess, and all of our knowledge depends on this. These three problems, illustrate a larger, overarching problem which is absolutely detrimental to any non-Christian epistemology. Each of these three problems, on their own, undermine either most or all of the collective knowledge of humanity, and each one of them require arbitrarily presupposed knowledge to avoid. Regarding the laws of logic, to utilize them presupposes the laws themselves. One must furthermore assume that they have an explanation that justifies their use as objective conceptual laws useful for ascertaining true knowledge. That itself is arbitrarily presupposed knowledge. Regarding the problem of induction, to derive general principles from specific evidences requires a presupposition that the general can be demonstrated from the specific. To predict the future based on past evidences requires a presupposition that the future will behave like the past. This is arbitrarily presupposed knowledge. Regarding the extent of knowledge, one must presuppose that there is not an undiscovered fundamental truth which undermines all of our knowledge. This is arbitrarily presupposed knowledge. Here's my point. It is often assumed that one must have a proper epistemology in place before one can claim to know anything about metaphysics or reality. On one level, this is true, but as demonstrated above, any pursuit after knowledge of any kind, any exercise in the realm of epistemology, necessarily presupposes something about the world, some metaphysical knowledge. But in order to have that knowledge, we need to have some sort of epistemology. But any exercise in epistemology requires knowledge about the world, which requires knowledge about epistemology, which requires knowledge about the world, and so on ad infinitum. Within that framework, an infinitely regressing spiral is unavoidable. Skepticism might seem like an attractive solution to these problems, but the claim that we can know nothing with certainty is itself a knowledge claim and thus is open to the same critiques which I outlined above. What is needed is a non-arbitrary epistemological starting point by which we can gain a firm footing within the spiral and gain some progress. The Christian worldview I am positing is the non-arbitrary starting point that we need. In regards to the laws of logic, the Christian God created this world as a revelation of himself and governs it in even the most minute detail. The laws of logic reflect his own thought as he governs and imposes his thinking upon the world. In regards to the problem of induction, God is immutable, unchangeable, and sovereignly upholds this world by his decretive word, ensuring that it behaves in a constant way. And there is a uniformity to nature, and that the future will behave like the past. In regards to the problem of the extent of knowledge, God knows all things. Because he knows all things, knowledge which we arrive at within the worldview contained within his revealed word will not be contradicted by some undiscovered piece of knowledge. In regards to the problems that I have not yet touched on, we can account for reliable sensory experiences and cognitive functions because they are necessary for the task that God has given to humanity. We can account for objective morality because it reflects the eternal revealed will of God pertaining to how his creations ought to behave. You might be wondering what makes my presupposition of the Christian God non-arbitrary when I'm saying that every other worldview's presuppositions are arbitrary. Not every presupposition is arbitrary. If that were the case, I would be committing the special pleading fallacy. But it is arbitrary to presuppose something in the face of criticism post hoc when it cannot be organically derived from your own worldview. Every other possible epistemological starting point is arbitrary for this reason. They cannot be organically derived from the worldview within which they are posited. Since my opponent is an atheist, I will use naturalistic atheism as an example. In the face of the problem of justifying the laws of logic, the naturalist must either presuppose logic itself or static properties of dynamic entities. Neither of these things can be derived from naturalism itself. Likewise, in the face of the problem of induction, the naturalist must presuppose the uniformity of nature, but once again, this cannot be derived from any form of naturalistic worldview, etc., etc. If they cannot be derived from the worldview in which they are being posited, naturalism in this case, where is the non-believer getting these principles? Every worldview other than the Christian worldview, even utter skepticism, is impossible to consistently maintain. Furthermore, because they can't account for knowledge, reason, logic, etc. within their own worldview, they unconsciously borrow from the Christian worldview in order to make their knowledge claims. That's where those principles are coming from, my worldview. In order to make knowledge claims. Can knowledge, the uniformity of nature, logic, morality, reliable sensory experiences, reliable cognitive functions, and so on be accounted for apart from a Christian worldview? No, but non-Christians utilize those concepts anyway, and it is unavoidable. Thus, they borrow from my own worldview, attesting to its truth. We ask tonight, does the God of the Bible explain our reality? In fact, he is the only thing that can explain our reality. Therefore, I challenge my opponent to provide a consistent epistemological starting point tonight apart from the Christian worldview and to use the principles of logic and reasoning in a consistent manner without relying upon the principles of my worldview. If he cannot do so, and I believe that he cannot, then everything he says tonight will actually prove my position. Now,
1 minute left.
My opponent has appealed to the Noahic flood and what we know about the state of the world by use of inductive reasoning in order to disprove that the Noahic flood as described by the Bible actually happened. Before we can get into that, though, we have to address the fact that he used an aspect of reality, the uniformity of nature, by which he used inductive reasoning. And that is much more basic in the context of tonight's debate about reality than the Noahic flood itself. And so, until my opponent is able to provide an account for the uniformity of nature and justify the inductive reasoning that he is using, then he hasn't explained reality in any sense whatsoever. That's it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. KingXerxes, are you ready for your rebuttal?
Not quite yet.
All right.
I'm having difficulties here. For whatever reason, in the middle of Chris's rebuttal, his volume crashed on my end.
Did that happen to everybody or just him?
I heard the full thing, but I think it was just him.
Yeah, I'm trying to reset. I think I just reset it now.
Do I need to go back
I'm
over
hearing
anything?
you guys in my headset, and according to the OBS, it is, in fact, coming through. So, Chris, your audio is going to be a little weird on the upload because it's going to be coming through my headset.
You can borrow my audio.
That's fine, and if you will, email me whatever document you use so I can put it in the description, because a lot of what you said in the middle there got cut out because I was trying to fight my computer at that time.
Yeah, I'll give you that.
So that everybody can hear it. And I hope that, again, you were recording as well, which helps things.
Yeah, I am. Do you need me to give you, go over any points for the sake of the debate?
No.
Okay.
Most everything was heard, and here heard it as well. So it was just a problem on my end.
All right.
I'm ready to start now, Evie, if you want to go ahead and hit the timer.
I'm ready when you are.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So first I'd like to start by rebutting my opponent's claim that knowledge is finite, that there's a measurable, predetermined quantity of knowledge out there. We know this isn't true because you can simply generate knowledge by thinking it. And every time you generate a new thought, you've generated new knowledge, and that's something that you can know and pertain to yourself, even if it's only internal. Anytime something is invented, that's new knowledge, because 5,000 years ago, cell phones didn't exist, but now they do exist. So to know how to use a cell phone is new knowledge that wouldn't have previously been available to people. Knowledge isn't finite, it's infinitely generating, because the mind itself is an emergent property. It is an accumulation of smaller steps to get us to where we are now. And we can see this within the evolution of animals. You know, humans aren't exclusive in being able to know things about their environment and their reality. Other animals possess and exhibit the ability to know things about their environment and rely on patterns that they observe. unless Doulos wants to argue that every animal also believes in the Christian God, then that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. We can rely on our senses to a degree, especially when we're able to sort of test them against one another. You know, if I pick up a rock and I hold it and I weigh it and I get a certain result from that, and then somebody else does the same thing and they get the same result, that starts a pattern. And patterns are reliable until they're not anymore. But we don't need to worry about that because that's immediately self-correcting. There's really no problem with induction and observing the past and making predictions about what the future will be or how the world is going to work, because these are all emergent properties and they happen fairly naturally. As a matter of fact, I don't think I've ever seen a plant grow out of the ground that didn't follow the same exact pattern as every other plant that's ever grown out of the ground. They happen in a very consistent method, one that would almost argue that there's no outside intelligence guiding that. That's just the way it happens. If there were truly an all-powerful, all-knowing agent that is controlling everything, there's no reason why the universe would have to behave the exact same way every single time, because these rules would just be arbitrary. They'd be a whim that some God created that manifested. And when we read the Bible and we read the descriptions of the biblical God, that's the picture that we get painted. God violates the rules of the laws of physics all the time. When he parts the waters in the Red Sea, when he held the sun still in the sky for Joshua and his soldiers when they were fighting the Amalekites. He does this very regularly, where the laws and rules of physics as we know them, what reality appears to be as we know it, doesn't work. It doesn't function that way. He's like an engineer playing a Sims game. The rules are whatever he makes it in the moment, and there's no reason why anything has to be this way or that way. But what we know about reality to be true now is that the universe does have to be this way or that way. We adhere to what Doulos was referring to earlier as the laws of logic, and he argues that they are something that are manifest from the nature of God. But then that would also imply that God could violate the laws of logic if he chose to, which I don't think that Doulos agrees with. I don't think he thinks that the laws of logic can be violated by God. And that brings us into other questions. We're trying to ascertain whether or not this universe is explained by specifically the God of the Bible. But nothing in our reality that we can observe right now is explained by the God of the Bible. In fact, I would argue it goes in direct contradiction to the God of the Bible. The God of the Bible is described as being infinitely powerful, therefore possessing no limit on his ability, yet for whatever reason he had to go about a system which required the sacrifice and murder of an innocent human being. I guess you could argue was his incarnate to absolve us of sin, of our errors and flaws and the things that we do that are morally wrong according, again, to his own whim. All of the structures that we see around us are a whim. Think about that for a second. There's no reason why they have to be the way they are. I would use an analogy of the alphabet, the A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, P. There's no reason why the alphabet has to be that way. It doesn't have to be in that order. We made it to be in that order. But how preposterous would it be if we started damning people or punishing people for not using the alphabet in the way that we arbitrarily designed it to be used? It doesn't affect anything one way or the other, but that's the way the God of the Bible is presented. He creates the entire universe in a very specific way, knowing in advance how that was going to impose suffering on people. And he pretends as though, in the Bible, he pretends as though he doesn't have a choice in the matter, that it has to be this way. He had to sacrifice his son to absolve us of our sins. That was the only way to do it. He couldn't just say, I forgive you. There had to be blood involved for some reason, which calls back to the primitive superstitions about what blood is. You know, you had to give a sacrifice of an animal in order to please God. You had to burn it to please God. That's the way it had to be. Well, that would imply that there's something that compels God to behave in a certain way, that all of his characteristics and attributes are imposed upon him by something else, something transcendental to him. Is it true that God just maintains every true proposition in his head simultaneously? He just knows what the truth is. He knows all outcomes. If that's the case, then how does he know those things? Are they all a part of some predetermined blueprint that he didn't have a say in, or did he determine them himself? These are interesting logical questions that open up a trapdoor in those laws of logic that Doulos was talking about previously. If it truly is the case that the God of the Bible exists and the laws of logic aren't laws, they're suggestions. And they're suggestions that the arbiter of them regularly violates on his own terms. If God is all-knowing and all-powerful, could he do something that he didn't know he was going to do in advance? Does he behave in a way that he didn't foresee eons ago? Or is he himself acting to the script that he thought of eons ago, before the universe was ever created? These things call into question the very nature of how we measure time. This God supposedly exists outside of that, but is able to manipulate what operates inside of it. And we don't see his hand reaching out of all realm dripping with physics the way it should be. We don't see when God comes in and uses his omnipotence to mess up our world. No, our world continues to operate exactly as it always has done, and is exactly as it will continue to do as long as we're available to observe it. We don't see trees sprouting out of the ground with magic fruit. We don't see animals that can talk the way that you and I can with articulate speech, understanding syntax and grammar, the way that we're supposed to believe the donkey did when he talked to Balaam, or the way that we're supposed to believe a serpent did when he talked to Adam and Eve. Well, Eve, not Adam. We don't see 10-foot tall giants walking around the land, wielding swords that 6 men couldn't carry. We don't see these magical natural disasters that happen out of the ether, the way that they are described in the plagues in Exodus. These instantaneous and overt violations of the laws of logic and the laws of physics don't happen anymore, almost to suggest that they never happened to begin with. When we're trying to determine what happened in the past as a way of predicting the future, we instinctively rule out claims of the grandiose, of the mystical, and of the supernatural, especially when we're talking in literal terms. We seem to only make this exception when we're talking about gods and religion. But they don't really explain anything. They cap the explanation because we're not aware of the mechanism. If I tell you how a cell phone works, I'm going to explain step by step each mechanism. But if we're trying to attempt to explain how God creates the universe, well, what words do we use? He just did it? He snapped his fingers and there it was? He materialized it out of a vacuum? No, those sorts of concepts violate what we know to be true about the world itself. And so it takes a lot more to suggest that that is actually how it happened. But if it is how it happened, why isn't it continuing to happen like that? Why aren't planets just popping out of the ether the way that they supposedly did at the beginning of time? Why is it the case that everything that we read in the stories of the Bible aren't still happening? That these magical elements, these mystical elements that would be possible if it were true that an all-powerful God exists and just wanted to do it that way, why aren't they still happening? Did God change his mind? Is he capable of changing his mind? What are the implications of changing his mind? This is not a mechanism of explanation. Whenever someone asks as a child, where did the presents under the tree come from? You say Santa Claus. And then they might ask, well, how did Santa Claus do it? Well, he flies around the world in a magic sleigh, carried by magic reindeer. And as a child, you don't sit there and question that. Because you don't know enough about the world to understand why that doesn't work, why that explanation isn't coherent. And as you get older, you tend to figure it out. You might look up the chimney and wonder how a man who supposedly weighs hundreds of pounds were able to fit down it. And that's what my perspective is. God is a man who weighs hundreds of pounds attempting to fit down a chimney. We have a universe that obeys a very specific set of laws, and a God who's supposedly not bound by them. Those two things are not congruent.
30 seconds. All right,
I'm done.
thank you. And we're going to start the open discussion. Your extra time results in like 21 minutes instead of 20. So you guys can start now.
All right. Do you agree that the laws of logic are a part of reality?
Oh my God, I don't know why that just happened again, but for whatever reason, his audio cut out.
Yeah, it cut out for me too.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay,
I'll repeat the
I was just
question.
losing my mind.
Can you hear
No
me
problem.
now?
I stopped the clock and I'm ready
Yeah, go
to start
ahead.
when you guys want. Go ahead.
You can hear me now?
Go ahead.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. Do you agree that the laws of logic are part of reality?
The laws of logic are part of reality?
Yeah.
Yes.
Did you not utilize the laws of logic in that most recent rebuttal?
Did his audio just cut out for everybody else too?
A little bit, yeah.
Yes, I did.
I'm going to stop the clock. Do you want to leave and rejoin and see if that works?
Yeah, I can do that.
Okay, thank you. All right.
All right.
Are you there?
Is it cutting out?
Not anymore.
Okay.
No, but your audio is a little bit digital. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, did you just utilize the laws of logic in that most recent rebuttal?
Yes.
That would make the laws of logic more basic in the epistemological problem than everything you just said. More basic in reality. Is that correct?
If by basic you mean foundational, then yes.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Did you justify the laws of logic in your rebuttal?
I did not. I guess not in the same way that you attempted to do so, no.
Why should I take anything you said seriously then?
Because the laws of logic are evident. They're brute facts, as you would say. They happen because they happen. And even if we don't have an explanation for why they happen, we can still observe that they do happen.
Yeah, but this debate is about how we explain reality, is it not?
Yes.
Yeah,
well, it's specifically the God of the Bible explain reality. And the laws of logic are part of reality. And if a God exists, it's in direct violation of those laws.
Right.
So wouldn't that be a point on my end?
I don't think God existing is a direct violation of those laws. You figured that by miracles, obviously, but yeah, I would define laws of logic about how the universe behaves in a closed system, but whenever God reaches his hand into the system, it's not a closed system anymore.
So you're saying there's another set of rules outside of the system that we live in?
I'm not saying there's another set of rules. I'm just saying that God can behave outside of the closed system if he needs to for his purposes.
But what's the mechanism he's using to behave outside the system? You say he explains reality. How did he create reality? What was his mechanism?
An application of supernatural power.
But what is the mechanism that employs that? Where does he generate it from?
From his own being.
Well, where did that come from?
It didn't come from anything. It's eternal.
So it did, in fact, come from nothing.
It didn't come from nothing. You're confusing categories.
Well, if something doesn't come from anything, then by default it comes from nothing.
No, come from is a verb. I'm not saying that God ever performed the verb of came from. He just is. I think that's a pretty simple concept.
So he was, in fact, generated by nothing.
Nothing generated him. He exists apart from everything. He's independent.
But what is the mechanism that allows that? When we're talking about the way the universe operates and it works, and we understand how reality works, and when I say reality, what I'm talking about is everything that is real. Everything that is real exists within reality. So if God is real, he too would exist in reality, even if there's like layers to reality that all act different than the previous.
Right. Oh, I'm saying God is an ultimate, right? So by you asking the question, where did God come from? What's the mechanism? What allows him to do that? You're automatically discounting him as ultimate. So, either you need to say that ultimate things in general aren't possible.
But even if he is ultimate, there should still be a mechanism he's using. Did he just create the mechanism?
The mechanism he's using is the application of supernatural power. I don't fully understand.
Well, what is supernatural power? What's supernatural power?
Supernatural power is the application of the power that's in God. Like I said, I don't fully understand.
So it's exclusively God's. Where did he get it from?
From his own being. He's ultimate.
What determined his being?
Nothing determined his being. He simply is.
But that's not an explanation. That's just an assertion of a brute fact. It doesn't explain anything, and it just creates more questions
he
than
is
answers.
His own explanation. That's what I'm saying. He's ultimate, and he exists as ultimate uniquely in this universe. Are you saying that ultimate things are impossible?
I'm not saying that. I'm asking how can you
that's the
determine whether something
implications
is
of
or
your
isn't.
line of reasoning.
No. How could you determine whether something is or isn't ultimate? Do we both agree that this universe isn't ultimate?
Yeah, we do.
I don't. I don't know if it's ultimate or not. I don't know if there's anything exterior to this universe. Maybe this universe is all that there is.
Oh, all right. Then what's your... So you may have an explanation, you may not. If it's ultimate, you don't have an explanation. If it's not ultimate, then you do. Or you don't.
Am I the only one that hears him going digital right now?
I stopped the clock. He was fine for me, but talk again, Chris?
Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing,
okay, yeah, I got him. Go ahead.
Okay, ready? Go ahead.
All right. Had you heard what I said?
Not really, no.
So, I mean, the debate question, as I understand it, is does the existence or the non-existence of the God of the Bible better explain reality, correct?
Yeah, and my position would have to be argued from the basis that if the God of the Bible exists, what we see in the observable universe doesn't make sense.
All right. So what we see in the observable universe doesn't make sense. I'm saying that reasoning depends on the laws of logic and the laws of induction, which are more basic than the reasoning that you're using. So until you can explain those things, you haven't demonstrated a basis for being able to use those. If we discuss those things, I'm not saying I don't have answers to those things, but if we discuss those things...
Is experience not a sufficient basis?
Based on the problem of the uniformity of nature, I would say absolutely not. And also, experience is by nature subjective. We're trying to demonstrate objective things, not subjective things. Subjectives can't demonstrate objectives.
But that's not what I was talking about. I can experience a pattern and understand that pattern operates the same way every single time I experience it.
Yeah, but that doesn't say anything about reality. That just says something about your experience.
It says that reality is consistent. Or at least my experience of reality is consistent.
Well, it says your experience of reality is consistent, but that doesn't
so why should I
necessarily
trust
say anything
anything that
about
violates
reality.
that consistency?
Why should you trust anything that violates that consistency?
Yes.
What are you saying violates that consistency? The Christian God?
A God that can do anything, like materialize the universe out of absolutely nothing?
Why should you trust a God who can materialize the universe out of absolutely nothing? That's what
because
you're asking.
that process would directly violate every single thing we've ever been able to demonstrate to be true about the reality.
Well, it violates everything we know about natural laws, but I'm not saying that happened by natural law.
Natural law is what governs reality. You can't give me a demonstration of a law that isn't natural.
No, God is what governs reality.
How do you know that?
Because the Bible. And using God as my
So if I were able...
presupposition,
But wait a minute. So, Doulos, do you think that the Noachian flood happened?
In some sense, yes.
Well, no, not in some sense. I mean in the sense the Bible says it happened. Either it happened the way the Bible says it did or it didn't. And if it didn't, that means the Bible isn't a trustworthy
Well, then yes, I
source.
believe the Noachian flood happens. But what the Bible means by the Noachian flood happened, that's open to debate and discussion among biblical scholars.
Wait a minute. So the God who's supposed to be able to sufficiently explain where the universe came from, it creates a book that's open to interpretation? Really? A book that says things it doesn't actually mean that you have to read into? That's interesting.
The God of the Bible revealed a word that is sufficiently clear for its basic principles. Not everything within that Bible can be immediately clear, but things such as the governance of God over creation.
Why not? Hold on. Why can't it be immediately clear?
Why does it have to be? If we can,
That's my point exactly, Doulos. Nothing has to be the way that it is, but it is that way.
Right, but this is, we're talking about the Bible here. We're not talking about objective reality outside of the Bible. So let's keep things on the Bible. So you're challenging me, right, as to why isn't the Bible that way? You're trying to reductio ad absurdum me. So I'm saying within the Christian worldview, why are you saying that the Bible has to be that way?
Because if God wants to clear and concise and can be understood by everybody who reads it, then he wouldn't have created it in a way that is directly antithetical to that.
It is clear
either God wants people to be confused or God is inept.
It is clear for everything in matters of salvation.
No, it isn't, because there's 41,000 different denominations of Christianity, and each one has a different, sort of method for getting saved. Is it good works that saves you, or is it justification by faith alone?
All right, let me ask the question. If I say this rock is green and you hear this rock is blue, is the problem with me or with you?
Or it might just be how you see color, because color is determined by the way that light reflects off of an object.
Okay,
and the way that light reflects off of an object is consistent.
If an omniscient being says this rock is green and you hear this rock is blue, is the problem with the omniscient being or with you?
Maybe the omniscient being is lying to me, because just because an omniscient being has every true proposition in its head simultaneously doesn't mean that it's going to convey those things to me accurately.
Could I please get a clear answer to the question?
I just gave you one. It's a false dichotomy. It could very well be the case that being is lying to me. as a trick or for its own entertainment.
Right, but the Christian
Just because it knows everything does not
that the Christian worldview doesn't posit that God is lying. So now you're arguing against a worldview that is not mine. So you can argue that all day. But
so God can't lie?
God does not lie. No, he can't. He always acts in accordance.
Well, why
with
not?
his being. He always acts in accordance with his being. That's what I'm saying.
So he is in fact compelled by something.
He's compelled by himself. Yes, which is exactly that's completely.
So could he change that if he wanted to? Does he have the conscious will to change that if he wants to?
Then he wouldn't be ultimate.
Well, why not?
Because if something is ultimate, it's by definition perfect. If it's by perfect, any change from perfection would by necessary be a change from from perfection to non-perfection.
Well, what's
so
perfect?
If there's any change, he's ultimate. Perfect is God.
Why can't he change what perfect means?
Because it's him. He's ultimate. You're trying to set an ultimate standard above God. The only ultimate standard is God. So you can keep asking these questions. You're going to be asking questions about a worldview in which there's an ultimate above God.
Don't you think that if you're trying to postulate an explanation for the universe, that you should be able to explain what the explanation is?
I'm saying that the explanation is ultimate.
Your direct
and
challenge to me in the beginning was my debater can only win if he reduces my worldview to absurdity, and that's exactly what I am doing right now as we speak. I am pointing out to you that when you are trying to present a will, something with a mind, as being ultimate, you run into a huge problem because the mind, ostensibly, is free from compulsion. It can do whatever it wants, and if God can't do whatever he wants, he's being compelled by something. What compels him? Now you've just moved the standard back.
God is free from compulsion. He acts according to his own being. So he can, in fact,
do whatever he wants?
No, he does whatever he does. Whatever he wants to do is what's in accordance with his own being.
But he can't act outside of his own being.
Right. That's why he only wants to do with what's in accordance with his own being.
Is he unable to do anything outside of the accordance of his own being? Because if that's not the case, then he is in fact being compelled. That he has a limitation and he is not all powerful.
Within the Christian worldview, you can't ask a would God question or a could God question without a would God question. Those things are inseparable.
That's false. That is an ad hoc excuse to get out of that trap.
That's not an ad hoc.
I can take a knife and stab my dad to death. I would never do that. But I'm not asking a question of desire. I'm asking a question of ability. Because your ability to do something is entirely separate from your desire to do that thing.
It's a direct reflection upon the nature of God as ultimate, as clearly demonstrated in the Bible. You don't understand that philosophical category, obviously. Because God is ultimate, then any change from that standard of ultimacy would no longer be ultimate. There's only one possible thing that can be ultimate. That's a basic law of logic. Only one thing can be ultimate. If God changes from what he is now to something that he is not, then he wouldn't be ultimate anymore. That's Doctrine of God 101.
Okay, so he is in fact compelled by something outside. So you're saying that the laws of logic
by something outside. He is only compelled by himself. It's completely independent within the divine being.
That is directly contradictory to what you just said beforehand. It's a law of logic that if something can change, it's not ultimate. So God is compelled by the laws of logic. They transcend him.
The laws of logic are within God. Are you familiar with Euthyphro's dilemma?
Yes.
Are you consciously using that now, or are you unconsciously using that?
Euthyphro's dilemma is about morality, not about what we're
right. But you're applying the same reasoning. It's about ultimate standards and how that applies to God. Plato used it in relation to morality, but you're using it in relation to metaphysics. It's the same thing, just with ultimate standards and logic instead of.
So. Whatever, my question still stands. Like you just said that according to the laws of logic, something can't be ultimate if it changes.
Right, and the laws of logic are from within God. It's his own.
So he can change what the laws of logic are then?
No, he can't, because he always acts in accordance with his own being. You can keep asking me these questions. You can find that my answers are going to be completely consistent, and they're not going to gain any.
They're not consistent with reality.
Reality is as God defines it within my worldview. So you're trying to reductio my worldview.
No. Well, you challenge me. You say, "Hey, you got to reductio ad absurdum my worldview in order to make it inconsistent." But then you just completely dodge the questions.
Well, you can't reductio ad absurdum a worldview and the positive version of reality that doesn't comport with that worldview. Then you're not reductio ad absurdum my worldview anymore.
Yeah, I am, because you are back to the point of a viciously circular argument. It is because it is because it is. And that's all you're offering. That's not an explanation. That is a cap to an explanation. That is the direct desire to not look any further. You're presenting an argument that you don't want to keep going.
That's the nature of ultimate things. So, I mean, the implications of your reasoning is that it's impossible for anything to be ultimate.
I have never said anything about being ultimate. I have never said anything about that.
Well, that's the implications, because I'm giving a very
it's not an implication. I'm asking questions.
I'm giving a very philosophically consistent definition and explanation of what an ultimate thing is. You can check any philosopher, any theologian.
Right, but
that's what an ultimate thing is.
I don't know if you
and so you
recognize
saying
this
that that by necessity is illogical. You're saying that ultimate things are impossible, and I'm asking by what standard are you saying that?
Yeah, again, here's the thing. Like, if I heard you correctly, you literally just said that you're making a circular argument.
I did not say I'm making a circular argument. I'm saying that ultimate things, by necessity, by their very nature, can only be explained by themselves. If you're saying that's a fallacy, then by definition, you're saying that ultimate things are impossible. And if you're saying that
I'm saying there's no way you can demonstrate that. I'm saying there's no way that you can demonstrate that, and the attributes that you put on your God directly contradict that.
Define demonstrate.
Produce evidence that it's true or comports with reality. Data or facts that are positively indicative of and exclusively concordant with one available explanation over any other.
Are you a logical positivist?
If I knew what that meant, maybe.
Do you agree that something can only be meaningful if it requires a empirically verifiable explanation?
Repeat that. I'm stupid. You're going to have to be slow with me, okay?
Something can only be meaningful. A proposition can only be meaningful if it can be verified with empirical means. That's the reasoning you're using.
What do you mean by meaningful? You mean true?
True, meaningful, has any correlation whatsoever to reality.
Okay, I can say that this particular food tastes good, but that's subjective in my own mind. That's not something that can actually be verified, but it's still meaningful, because if I tell people this food tastes good, they might be inclined to give me some.
Right, you're not answering my question. Do you agree with that proposition?
Because your question is horribly worded, and it sounds like a trap.
It's not a trap. I'm stating a very common philosophical position that a lot of atheists have. And I'm simply explaining it as it would be displayed in a philosophical dictionary. I can actually get my dictionary of philosophy right now and read you the definition and ask if you agree with it.
I don't think that things are meaningful just because they can be demonstrated empirically.
Okay, then you're not a logical positive. I was just asking. That is the implications of what you were using. If the only way that I can demonstrate that God is ultimate is by giving you some kind of empirical rationale for it, I mean, that's what logical positivism is, even if you're saying that you don't hold to that.
Right, but you're trying to say that God is an explanation for an empirical reality.
Yes.
Without providing any empirical means. But let me go extrapolate off that for a little bit, because I wanted to get into this, but we hadn't steered the conversation there until now. We can observe that things that aren't physical, like ideas or abstract concepts, are generated entirely by things that are physical, i.e. the human brain. But we have absolutely no demonstration of the anterior to that, meaning that something non-physical could generate something that is physical.
Okay. That's assuming the principle of induction. And it's also a black swan fallacy.
I'm not saying that it's absolutely the case that only physical things can generate things that are non-physical or
then
physical.
On what basis are you saying the idea that God did nonsensical?
I'm saying that our reality possesses this particular characteristic. So if your explanation of our reality is in direct violation of the pattern that we've observed, and that we don't have any evidence could actually be broken, then you're not explaining anything. You're just asserting something.
All right. Well, once again, I'm providing an explanation. You haven't given me any means by saying this doesn't actually explain it.
Yes, I did. That's the first thing I did. It doesn't offer any mechanism of explanation. Right? That would never be accepted in any other endeavor. If I said, "Explain to me how this car got in the driveway," you would never say it was
the fact
dropped
that
there.
another endeavor doesn't explain it. I mean, you keep utilizing the laws of logic, and you are consistently refusing to give a law of logic. You're just asking me for my explanations. You have refused to meet the burden of proof for you in this debate to meet the explanations for the logical laws of logic. You've completely failed your task in this debate.
No, my task was to reduce your worldview to absurdity, and I did that, and you got angry and tried to change the topic.
Okay, guys, that's going to be the end of the opening discussion, or the open discussion. KingXerxes, you are starting with the closing argument, and let me know when you're ready.
Okay, cool, yeah. My closing is very simple. That the God of the Bible is described as a magical, anthropomorphic, immortal being that can use powers to manipulate the laws of reality in any way that he seems fit. We don't see that happening at all, ever. We see that the laws of reality, the laws of the universe, operate consistently every single time they're observed. And any time that we test them, they operate the exact same way. And if there was ever occurred a time where our test produced a different result, we would test the test to make sure we got it right, because that's the essence of understanding our reality. Our reality obeys a certain set of rules, and they don't change, at least not that we've ever observed. If a God existed that was all-powerful, the way the Bible describes, they should be changing all the time, because God can do whatever he wants, and he can will whatever he wants at any given time. And we know that the Bible, the same Bible that depicts this God that we're arguing about, makes claims about reality that are patently false. We know, as well as we can know anything, that at no point was the earth entirely submerged in water, especially not water that ascended above the highest of mountains. And at no point did every species of animal, in pairs or sometimes in septuplets, get on that boat, which was measured to be a quarter of the size of the Titanic, and it was not piloted or captained by one man and his 7 family members. And they were all hundreds of years old. We know that didn't happen. This Bible makes claims about reality that are demonstrably incorrect. And this is the God that is in this Bible is the God that best explains reality? Preposterous. I'm done.
Alrighty. And Chris, I'm ready when you are.
All right, thank you so much. I'm a little bit confused at the conclusion of this debate, simply because my opponent had the burden of proof in this debate to provide an explanation for reality, and he didn't try to meet that reality whatsoever. He just attempted to reductio ad absurdum my belief. I provided an explanation, he didn't. By default, right there, already I've won the debate. Second of all of his critiques of my positions had to do with logical laws of logic. This is why I opened with that in my first rebuttal. He didn't provide any justification for the laws of logic whatsoever within his worldview. He only utilized them. I told you at the beginning of the debate, the person who is able to justify their presuppositions is a person who's won this debate. KingXerxes did not even try to justify that presupposition. He just asserted it. It's therefore, because it's a presupposition and a part of reality, as he agreed, it's more basic than everything else in this debate. And so the fact that he didn't justify or even try to justify it automatically invalidates everything he said, because we're talking about reality. He didn't go to the basic foundational justification for reality. He stuck to the ancillary things, which I'm very disappointed about. I was hoping to have a conversation about the ultimate justification for things. He tried to demonstrate that the God of the Bible doesn't make any sense because it doesn't compel. He's compelled by something outside of himself. I'm not entirely sure where that argument was coming from, because it was presented only in questions and never in direct proposition. But the implications of the questions he were asking is that anything that is ultimate is by definition illogical. What's your standard for the fact that something that's ultimate is automatically illogical? He didn't provide that. This is an argument. This is a debate about our explanation for reality. The question of the debate does the existence or the non-existence of God provide better explanations for reality? He didn't meet that burden of proof.
Hello?
He simply assumed things.
Can you hear me?
Hold on, Sig. Don't do it yet. Chris, go back to
All right.
finish your ending, and then Sig can ask his question.
Yeah, was I going over?
No. It's just that when I started the queue, it automatically muted everybody.
Oh, okay. He simply assumed things and then applied his assumptions to my worldview. Once again, I'll say it again. I provided explanations. He did not. I don't think that he was able to successfully reductio ad absurdum my beliefs. That'll fall to you guys to decide. And so I think I've clearly won this debate. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for your closing. We're going to start up the questions. And the first person up is Sig Semper. I have to unmute you really quick. And you're good to start your question, Sig.
Hey, I'm sorry. I was thinking about my question, and I've decided to revoke it, and I would like to leave the queue. I'm sorry.
Not a problem. The next person up is going to be Religion is Bullshit.
Religion, are you there? All right,
You're
we'll
not
go ahead.
currently server muted.
Yeah, he'll rejoin in a second. We'll go to the Black Doctor.
Alrighty, Black Doctor, you're up.
Hi. Let's see. This question is going to be for KingXerxes.
Go ahead.
You said in the debate that basically reality just exists on brute facts, and that means all of your foundations for the laws of logic are axiomatic, meaning they just are. If that's the case, then by what standard are you actually critiquing Doulos or Chris for having his be found in the nature of God? And since he's eternal, you could make the argument that he's axiomatic.
Because I can empirically observe and test and use and function with the laws of logic, and I can do none of those things with God.
But does that actually have any relevance to it?
Yes. Because God is
the only thing you're doing is basically observing brute facts. You can also technically observe God through actual revelation, what he decides to reveal to us.
No, because that's violating Occam's razor. Everything outside of logic, if you postulate some sort of explanation or justification for the laws of logic, you're violating Occam's razor. You're just providing an assumption, and there's no need to do that, especially when it's not effective.
Well, that assumes that the belief in God is an assumption.
It is.
Simply saying it is doesn't actually mean it is.
If you could demonstrate that a God exists, then it wouldn't be an assumption.
I would say that people have. And the actual problem is that, sinful people who want to suppress the truth of God and unrighteousness, as Romans 1 says. So the problem is
Romans 1 was written about 1,000 years after the Bhagavad Gita was written, which postulates an entirely different God.
Your point?
My point is that gods have been presented to us throughout all of history, and you have no problem discarding 2,999 gods, but we're supposed to take your God at face value based on a book that we can demonstrate is not concordant with what we know about reality.
In the exact same way that we can disprove 999,000 pieces of counterfeit money, but actually having one actual dollar that actually is, real money.
But that requires that you can test the dollar.
And we can. But
what test can you devise to determine that a God exists?
By the evidence that he has given us, by both natural revelation and special revelation.
Your dollar analogy doesn't really work because dollars have empirical tests. They have empirical characteristics that you can empirically determine.
As well as natural and spiritual revelation. They both have...
Well, the other 40,000 denominations of your own religion would serve as a testament against that.
First of all, let's actually get rid of that 41,000 denominations. From an actual empirical study, there are very few biblical denominations.
Biblical denominations, what does that mean?
Those who actually believe that the Bible is the Word of God, that Jesus actually lived lived, died, and rose again, that he is actually God, and that...
Yes, I agree that there are fewer denominations who take the Bible 100% literally.
Then that completely disputes your 41,000.
No, it doesn't.
Yes, it does.
Because a Christian is defined as somebody who believes that Jesus Christ is the incarnate of God, died on the cross, and rose again after 3 days, and is the ultimate sacrifice for sin.
Can I step in here?
Grace. That's a Christian.
Sorry,
I'm talking about Christian denominations, not Bible denominations.
Can I step in here?
Go ahead,
Yes,
Chris.
please.
That study, and I'd like you to look at it, look at that study, provide a source for that study. That study, by the latest numbers, the way they counted denominations, I would say had a terrible methodology. They included in their denomination count independent churches, which by definition are not denominations. For example, the church that I went to before moving, as I recently did, is independent. John MacArthur's church is independent, but they are almost an exact clone of John MacArthur's church. And so that study would have equated their church and John MacArthur's church as two completely different denominations, where in reality the only difference between those two churches was the church that I went to thought that drinking alcohol was not a sin, while John MacArthur's church believes that drinking alcohol is a sin. I don't think that's a really meaningful difference between denominations, especially because two ordained ministers within one of those churches could have different opinions on that view. It's a completely faulty study, and it really bothers me when people quote that number.
Same here.
So what you're saying is we don't know how many denominations of Christianity there are.
I'm saying that
It's
there
not that
are
we don't
far
know, it's
less than
that
the
fact.
40,000
Why isn't there just one?
because sinful people
should there
misinterpret
be
the
just
Bible
How do I determine that you're not the sinful one?
by comparing what I say to the Bible.
Hey, Black Doctor, has your question been answered at this point?
Yes, it has.
Okay, alright. We're going to move on to another question here. We have a couple of people ready. So up next will be Religion is Bullshit.
It looks like
Chris.
his server muted.
He's not server. Yes, he is. Let's see. You're unmuted.
Hello, can I be heard?
Yes.
You can be heard.
Perfect. Okay, so my question is for Doulos. Do you believe in your God based on faith?
That gets into a very interesting question about why individuals believe as opposed to the epistemic justification for deity. Why I believe in God is because the Holy Spirit has regenerated my heart, transformed me, and allowed me to see what clearly is and stop suppressing the truth that is within me, that is that God exists. So why anybody believes in God,
Is there an element of faith that goes into why you believe?
Certainly there is. We are saved by grace through faith. But that's not my epistemological justification.
But why is faith a reliable pathway to truth? Because on the assumption that I am a Hindu, I would believe in my religion, in my gods, as the case is, based on faith. So, again, on the assumption that you are actually correct, that your God is actually real, you would be believing in a true thing based on faith, and I would be believing in a false thing based on faith. So by that alone, can't we therefore say that faith is not a reliable pathway to truth?
I'd say faith alone isn't a reliable pathway to truth. That's why I didn't use that in my debate tonight. I used the epistemic argument of the transcendental argument for the existence of God.
Okay, but why not present hard factual evidence then, rather than a faith-based conclusion?
It isn't a faith-based conclusion.
Okay, we will have to agree to disagree there. That's the end of my question.
All right, thank you. Religion is Bullshit. Next up is Reliable Lefty.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, we can.
All right, cool. My question is for Chris. My question is, how do you justify the conclusion on an individual level that any given revelation is not a hallucination without the usage of the Bible?
Because it's an internally consistent system that bears out in every given task. So, I'm saying that it is possible for revelation to be something that is hallucinogenic in nature. I'm not categorically denying that. In fact, I think many revelations were hallucinations in nature, such as the Sibylline oracles. I mean, they literally... there was hallucinogens that they ingested in order to have their prophetic episodes. So I'm not denying that. What we need to do, though, like I said, is look at this and take these epistemological starting points, these ultimate presuppositions, and ask, do these things epistemologically bear out, or do they not? So, I would say that because the God of the Bible, as an epistemological starting point, consistently bears out in all of its specifics, then there's no basis whatsoever for saying that it's hallucinogenic in nature.
Okay, so just to clarify, you're saying that because your position is internally consistent, it's okay that there's no way to distinguish between like a schizophrenic break and a real revelation?
I'm not saying that. I'm saying because my worldview completely bears out in all its specifics in explaining the preconditions of intelligibility, we can have absolute epistemological certainty that it was not a hallucination.
All right, cool. That's it.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lefty.
A good question.
Next up is going to be Six Semper Tyrannis.
This question is directed at Xerxes. Do you believe that you operate from a basis free from presupposition?
No.
Okay, that is all I have to ask. I'm sorry, I muted myself. I have a question for Chris later on. So
You can ask it
that's
now.
fine. No, because I'm working on it mentally, how to articulate it.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Sick. And next up is Religion is Bullshit.
Okay, so my second question is again for Doulos. You had made the claim that God exists apart from our given reality. That is to say that He exists outside of time and space. Would that be an accurate summary of what you had stated?
I would say that the fact that God exists outside of time and space is an accurate statement, yes.
Okay, can you then explain to me what is the difference between something that exists outside of time and space and something that does not exist at all?
Because it's spiritual in nature. I would say spiritual, even though we can't empirically define it, is something that does definitely exist, and something that doesn't exist at all is not spiritual in nature. So I'm not claiming to have empirical knowledge about what something spiritual is. In fact, you can't have empirical knowledge about what something spiritual is. I'm just saying that there is something which definitely exists, which is spiritual in nature.
But you have
Can
no
you
way to
prove
determine
that claim?
Yes,
Can you
it's a
prove that claim?
transcendental argument for the existence of God.
Do you find arguments to be sufficient evidence to believe in arguably the biggest truth that we know, that we can know?
Yes, because the argument yields 100% epistemological certainty.
Okay, that's my question answered. You can move on.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Religion is Bullshit. Next up is Mr. Minority.
Thanks. My question is directed just towards Chris.
Thank you.
My question is that, like almost everything, things get lost in translation. So I was wondering what your stance is on, how maybe some things in the Bible could have been misinterpreted, could have been left out, or could have been suppressed.
Yeah, so that's an argument that is only possible to bring up if one has absolute ignorance of the way that we got the Bible today. So the New Testament, first of all, in the Old Testament, it hasn't passed through multiple languages of translation before it got into English. We still have the original languages. And second of all, the manuscript tradition for both the Old Testament and the New Testament are very good. The New Testament is much better than the Old Testament, but they're both still very good. We have very thorough records of when people were copying these things, what mistakes were made, and even where people made intentional attempts to change the Bible. And so I'm not saying that intentional attempts weren't made. I'm not saying that there wasn't any change over time. I'm saying that we can have confidence in what the Bible said as actually being the same as what came from the hands of the author, is because we actually have a record of all of that. And
But how do you know what came from the author?
Because we have a record of where the changes were.
But you don't have the originals to know what was changed.
Yeah, so, I mean, unless you're positing that the originals of the Bible were completely different, I mean, are you suggesting that as a possibility, that the originals were dramatically different?
Sure.
Right, so, I mean, the simple fact of that is that there's simply no proof of it. That is a positive claim that they're dramatically different. The canons of textual criticism, if that were true, would absolutely demand that there would be some sort of evidence presented. The fact is, with the New Testament, with historical evidence, we know what the original copying situation was, and the copying situation was that untrained scribes who were Christians were copying the Bible in unprofessional scriptoriums, and second of all, they were doing this all over the world. So copies of the original were made, and they were sent out everywhere in the world. So if there was any early corruption in broad strokes of what the Bible would say, there would have to be, in the 1st century AD, a worldwide conspiracy to change what the Bible said. It's what's called the uncontrolled transmission of the text. And because there's an uncontrolled transmission of the text, everybody was doing it everywhere simply at their own whims. We can have very good confidence that there wasn't any broad change, because if there was any broad change that was consistent enough to come to the Bible as we have it now, then there would definitely be manuscript evidence of it, and the manuscript
Mark chapter 16,
evidence,
verses 9 through 20.
Yes, and because we have manuscript evidence of that, we can count it out.
So why is it still in there in the vast majority of English translations?
In the vast majority of English translations, there's a note that says it was.
No, only in modern scholar translations. KJV doesn't have it. NKJV doesn't have it. NIV doesn't have it. NLT doesn't have it.
All right, Minority, was your question answered?
Yeah, it's answered.
All right, we're going to move on to the next question for the sake of time. We've got about 15 minutes left, and Six Semper Tyrannis, you're up again.
Okay, hello. This question is directed at Chris. How do you believe that the Noachic floods transpired?
I actually don't have clarity on that. Like I said, not every aspect of the Bible is perfectly clear. Personally, I lean towards a local flood. A flood that took place in a local area, because this was early in the world's history. Humanity was not spread out yet, and in order for God to purge the world of humans, didn't necessarily require a huge worldwide flood.
Except, isn't this a description that came directly from Moses rather than Noah?
Yes, your point?
My point is that Noah, the way he phrased it in the Hebrew Torah, why would it loosely translate to a local flood when he clearly states that the entire world was flooded?
Because world doesn't necessarily have to have the meaning of the whole entire geographical span of world. It can mean individual people within the world. It can mean a lot of different
things. But he didn't actually use that word.
You have to make a lexical argument for it. I mean, you have to make a lexical argument from the Old Testament that the word world has to be interpreted in that way. And I'm not saying that a worldwide flood is impossible. That's just what I lean towards. But, at base, I'm saying that you cannot even justify the laws of logic and the laws of inductive reasoning without presupposing the God of the Bible. And so to utilize the laws of logic and to utilize the laws of inductive reasoning against the God of the Bible, because they can only be justified by the God of the Bible, is actually self-contradictory and reduces to absurdity in the end. And so I don't know necessarily what the nature of the Noahic flood was with absolute certainty, but either way, it doesn't bother me.
Okay. Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah.
Do you believe that the testimony of Moses to be literal, as in it actually happened word for word as it's described in the Torah?
Well, as it's described in the Torah, assumes a certain interpretation of it. I believe that everything that happened in the Torah happened according to the sense that Moses intended it.
And Moses also refers to himself in the Torah of physical things that have transpired, and in fact he traces his lineage all the way up to Adam within, like, I forget explicitly where, my bad, but he does do that. So why would he trace his lineage if it's something that didn't literally happen?
Because the tracing of lineages has a lot of different uses in the ancient world. And so, you know, my thing with Genesis, and this is what I say all the time, is that Genesis does not tell us the age of the earth. And this is actually something that Xerxes has talked about with me before, unless he's flipped on this. You know, contextual data that we have from the ancient Near East around Genesis. You know, you have Babylonian kings who in their genealogies, people were living for 20,000 years. And so the numbers that were used in genealogies in ancient Near Eastern literature were understood at that time to not be taken literally and instead talk about the greatness of people. And so those numbers falling over time is a literary tool by which the increasing sin and the decreasing greatness of people is shown. And so, yeah, I don't.
And you attribute this way. You attribute this way of, like, applying years to somehow quantify someone's greatness to the Hebrews?
I think that's a valid deduction based on the contextual evidence, yeah.
Can you provide me contextual evidence of that?
I don't have an exact source off the top of my head. Right, I don't have a specific
Can you provide one to me later in the future?
Yeah.
All right, I would
How about
greatly
you
appreciate
guys
that.
schedule a debate on that subject? Is the Bible literally?
Oh, is the Bible to be taken literally? Possibly. I can definitely do that in the future if he's willing. But my question has been answered. Thank you.
All right.
All right.
Or even
Thank you,
better,
sir.
what is the correct interpretation of the Bible? That'd be fun.
That's way too big for a single debate.
All right. We've got our next question here from Lefty.
Hello?
We can hear you.
Hello. Can you hear me? Okay, cool. It looks like you can hear me now. Okay. Okay, so here's I just need to confirm that this is your position first before I ask a question. So it seems to be the case that your argument largely rests on containing no inherent contradictions and thus being logically consistent in all of its extrapolations as you've laid them out for us. In other words, because no part of your argument can be discredited, you believe that it is correct. Is this right?
As any argument works, yes.
Okay, you do realize that sufficiency is actually an insufficient explanation for a truth claim, correct?
Can you explain what you mean by that?
I mean, just because something is sufficient as an explanation, even if it does have no contradictions at all within it, you can lay out a perfectly concrete case that has nothing wrong with it at all, and it can still not be proven to be true unless you prove it to be true, right?
All right, so the law of non-contradiction says that two contradictory propositions cannot be true at the same time and in the same sense. Therefore, the ultimate explanation for the preconditions of intelligibility cannot have two contradictory explanations. Anything that is not the Christian worldview contradicts the Christian worldview as far as ultimate explanations. So,
wait, you're saying that the creation of the universe isn't a binary question on whether or not it happened in a specific way, but isn't everything a binary question on whether or not it happened in a specific way?
yes. I mean, yes, as far as yes or no, yeah.
Okay. Well,
But there can only be one ultimate explanation, and if the Christian worldview explains the preconditions of intelligibility in all of its particulars, then by definition there can be no other explanation. If the Christian worldview, let me finish. If the Christian worldview is not the ultimate explanation of the preconditions of intelligibility, then it will fail at some point, and I'm saying that it does not fail at any point.
Do you realize that? You're making a baseless assertion that just because your argument doesn't fail at any point, that it is true. That doesn't follow.
Yeah, it absolutely follows. An argument that doesn't fail at any point is valid and sound.
That is okay. Sure. All right.
Okay, and it looks like our last question is going to be by Rib.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can be heard. Okay, cool. Okay, so my question is once again for Doulos.
Big surprise.
Yeah. Okay, so the question is, do you believe that your God is a moral God? And if the answer to that question is yes, then why did he sanction slavery in Exodus 21 amongst other places?
Because in the context of Exodus 21, slavery was moral. I believe.
But how can you possibly make the claim that slavery was moral in any time?
There's two kinds of slavery taking place in Exodus 21. The first was more along the lines of indentured servitude, where somebody...
No, that's not the case. That's not the case.
Like I said, there's two kinds. One was more along the lines of indentured servitude, where somebody would willingly enter into a contract where they would be able to be saved from poverty. I mean, that's completely historically demonstrable and demonstrable from the text. The other kind of slavery is more along the lines of what we would call chattel slavery today, which is what most people have in their minds when they object to slavery. That slavery was an extension of the judgment
I object to the first one
nations.
too.
Yeah, I object to the first one as well. I just kind of want to point that out.
All right. Well, I didn't prepare sources for that, so I can't back up my claims. But I would die on that hill.
Okay, but do you believe that the chattel slavery, then, as you like to phrase it, is that moral? At any time?
In that context, when we have definite special revelation that this is the judgment of God on these people, then yes, in that context, it was moral.
But how can slavery in any context be moral?
If it's the judgment,
how can it possibly be a moral thing to own a person as property?
Because those people are
that you can beat as long as they don't die in 2 days. How can that possibly be moral?
If you're willing to take the standpoint that God, by right of creatorship within the Christian worldview, does not have the right to judge his creation, then it's not moral. But that's not something that can be demonstrated within the Christian worldview. So within the Christian worldview, it is moral. Because God is judging those people. Are you saying...
Well, it's not really a judgment, it's more of an order on what you can and cannot do.
Well, the people who the Israelites were told to go to war with were the surrounding nations who God was judging for their unrighteousness and sin. God didn't allow the Israelites to just go to war willy-nilly. They had to do it at the command of God as for a judgment for sin for the people around them, and that was a context in which they could take slaves.
Yeah, was he also judging the women and children that they could not kill and keep for themselves?
Yes, he was judging them.
Okay, I think that your God is completely and totally immoral, but however. That's the end of my last question.
Okay, thank you.
I'd like to add on to something if I could.
Go ahead, we've got 2.5 minutes left.
Okay. Yeah. You're referring to, I think, Deuteronomy chapter 20, 10 through 18, where God declares that the Israelites are going to go and siege a bunch of cities, and if they surrender, they become slaves, and if they don't, then the men get killed and everybody else becomes slaves. But Leviticus 25, 44 through 46 doesn't describe conquest. It describes a market where Israelites could go out and buy slaves that have been enslaved through other means, not through the conquest or decreed will of God.
From the nations that God has revealed are under his judgment, yes.
Right, but these people are being enslaved based on the same method that the blacks were being enslaved 200 years ago. They were getting captured and forced into an institution that they didn't consent to. And God is perpetuating that by allowing it.
Except the Bible explicitly condemns man-stealing.
No, it only does that for Israelites, and we went over that verse.
Yeah, I looked again. It explicitly condemns it in the New Testament. And so
there's a difference.
Where? Sorry, am I still unmuted? I am. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
I'll need to look that up.
There is 1 minute left.
It's in one of the letters of Paul. If we take that time, we can't finish. But it is in the New Testament. I'll provide that link afterwards. And so that's part of the eternal moral law of God. So man-stealing at any time was immoral. God only permits this in the context of conquest of nations under judgment.
Yeah, but what it's talking about there is kidnappers, not slave traders.
Yes,
30 seconds?
People who stole people in order to sell them, which is what you're talking about.
No, it doesn't make that distinction. It does not make that distinction. That protection is only afforded to the Hebrews. Likewise, in the Leviticus 25:46, it says that you may treat them as your property, but your fellow Israelites you may not treat harshly this way.
Yes,
It is directly juxtaposing the way you are allowed to treat slaves, the subhumans that they're allowed to keep as property, and Hebrews.
10 seconds.
Hebrews were not allowed to be kidnapped and sold into slavery. That protection does not exist in the Bible for anybody but Hebrews.
1 Timothy 1:10. I got the
We're going to have to end it here, guys. It is about 30 minutes after.
We're going to stop the recording.